They said the Atlantic Wall would hold. They said no army on earth could cross the channel against German guns, German concrete, and German engineering. And yet, as the summer of 1944 crept closer, something unsettling began to seep into the cracks, something no German general dared say out loud. The wall might not survive the first real punch. This is the story of how that fear began, long before the first Allied soldier ever touched the beaches of Normandy. And it starts with a warning almost everyone in Berlin ignored. In early 1944, the Third Reich looked invincible from the outside. But inside, the truth was far darker. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies were pushing relentlessly westward, annihilating entire German divisions in brutal winter offensives. Entire towns vanished under Red Army artillery. German commanders begged for reinforcements, but even Hitler understood. There were none. Every battalion lost in the East was one less soldier defending Europe. Yet, despite this collapse, Hitler clung to a belief he'd repeated for years: the West is secured. The Atlantic Wall, stretching thousands of miles along Europe's coastline, was supposed to make it true. But believing something doesn't make it real. And, in Germany's high command, reality was becoming harder to ignore. Hitler's confidence in the wall came from a fatal miscalculation. He believed the Americans were incapable of launching a complex amphibious invasion. In his mind, American factories could produce tanks and trucks, but American soldiers lacked the grit, the willpower, the brutality he associated with European war. He often mocked U.S. leadership as politicians in uniform. Worse yet, he believed any landing attempt would be so predictable, so obvious, that German defenses would crush it in the opening minutes. Hitler saw the channel not as a barrier that needed maintaining, but as a moat already won. The entire Western Front rested on an assumption, not a strategy. But down in the offices of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service analysts saw something else entirely. A sudden surge in Allied logistics. Training exercises repeated on the British coast. Unusual radio traffic patterns. Rail movements consistent with troop buildup. Even vague whispers from occupied France about Allied reconnaissance teams sneaking onto beaches to collect sand samples. Analysts compiled reports warning that the Allies were preparing something massive, something bigger than Dieppe or Tunisia. They sent these warnings up the chain. They were acknowledged. And then they were buried. Every report contradicted Hitler's narrative. And in the Third Reich, contradicting Hitler was a death sentence. Germany's coastal defense network included early warning radar systems, Freya and Würzburg, radar sets that, at least on paper, could detect Allied bombers hours before they reached France. German officers proudly briefed Hitler on these machines as proof of the wall's eyes. But these radars had blind spots. They struggled to detect aircraft flying low. Their range varied wildly depending on weather. Worst of all, many radar stations were undermanned, poorly maintained, or easily jammed. The technology looked modern. The reality was crumbling. And as Allied electronic warfare quietly evolved, Germany's radar became less a shield and more a false sense of security. Then came the coastline problem. Germany controlled nearly 400 miles of European shoreline, too much terrain, too few soldiers. Even after Hitler added new divisions, the math didn't change. A coastline that long cannot be defended wall to wall. Every meter fortified was a meter that needed men, mines, concrete, artillery, observation posts, communication lines, and supply routes. Multiply that across thousands of miles. The Atlantic Wall was never a wall. It was a patchwork quilt of strong points separated by long, vulnerable gaps. But few in Berlin dared say it. Hitler wanted a fortress. Generals wanted to survive. Still, even the bravest generals hesitated to challenge him until Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived. Fresh from the deserts of North Africa, Rommel was no stranger to Allied air power. He had seen how fighter bombers shredded German columns, how a single squadron could immobilize entire brigades. He understood something no one else on the Western Front truly grasped. Once Allied aircraft flooded the skies, any German counterattack would be slaughtered long before reaching the beaches. So Rommel concluded something radical. If Germany wanted to win, they needed to destroy the invasion the moment Allied boots hit sand. No deep defense strategy, no reserves hidden inland. The battle had to be fought at the shoreline, or it would be lost altogether. His first inspection of the Atlantic Wall was a shock. What propaganda painted as a fortress, Rommel saw as a half-built skeleton. Gun emplacements without ammunition, mines washed away by winter storms. Wooden tanks intended to fool Allied aircraft, but fooling no one on the ground. He found obstacles placed too high on the beach, where tides wouldn't even touch them. He found pillboxes pointing the wrong direction. He found trenches filled with water and mold. He famously said, "The wall is strong where it exists." That was his polite way of admitting the truth. Most of it didn't. Yet, while Rommel panicked, Hitler grew more confident. He gave speeches declaring himself the greatest builder of fortifications of all time. Newspapers showed photos of massive bunker complexes, many of which weren't finished or weren't real. Propaganda strengthened morale, but weakened strategy. German forces now believed in a fortress that didn't exist. And belief is a dangerous shield, because it blinds commanders to what's coming. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Allies were preparing openly. American divisions drilled amphibious landings on English beaches. British engineers tested new breaching vehicles. Canadian units practiced night assaults. Entire ports buzzed with activity. German agents reported all of it. But Berlin insisted the Allies were bluffing. After all, why would anyone attack a fortified coastline? Why not negotiate? Why not wait? Why not use bombing alone? This was Germany's greatest blind spot. They assumed the Allies would think like them. But the Allies weren't trying to win by matching German thought. They were trying to win by breaking it. And they understood something Germany didn't. Wars are not won by defending everywhere. They're won by overwhelming a single point. The Allies had already narrowed their landing choices to two, Pas de Calais or Normandy. Pas de Calais made the most sense. It was the closest point to England, the shortest crossing, the most direct road to Germany, which is exactly why the Allies avoided it. Napoleon once said, "Never do what the enemy expects." In 1943, Allied planners took that to heart. By winter, aerial photographs, resistance intelligence, and ground reconnaissance revealed Normandy's beaches were softer defended, less mined, and more isolated. Not weak, just weaker. Enough to penetrate. Enough to open a gateway into European soil. From that moment, the invasion clock began ticking. Every month the Allies grew stronger. Every month Germany grew weaker. And every month, Hitler burned through time he didn't have. But the true danger wasn't Allied strength, it was German inertia. Warnings piled up. Intelligence officers pleaded for flexible strategy. Rommel demanded reinforcement. Rundstedt begged to move tanks. Field reports contradicted propaganda. Yet each time, decisions stalled. Hitler didn't intend to gamble with Europe. He simply refused to admit the gamble existed. As spring turned into early summer, Allied ships crowded English ports. Troops waited in sealed camps. Thousands of aircraft prepared to dominate the skies. Millions of tons of supplies were stockpiled. Germany saw it. Germany measured it. Germany tracked it. And still, the Atlantic Wall stood unchanged. A monument to a belief that had already failed, the belief that the West was safe. What no one in the German high command knew, not the radar operators, not the generals, not even Hitler, was that they had less than 180 days before the greatest amphibious invasion in human history began. And worse, everything they believed about the Atlantic Wall, everything they had built their strategy upon, was about to be shattered in a single summer. They called it the Atlantic Wall, a line of concrete and steel stretching from the fjords of Norway to the beaches of Spain, an engineering marvel in Hitler's imagination, a propaganda masterpiece in German newspapers, and a fortress that promised to stop any Allied invasion before the first soldier touched the sand. But in reality, the wall was a monument to Germany's most dangerous illusion, the belief that fortifications could replace strategy. And by the time the Allies truly began their preparations, the wall had already failed long before a single rifle cracked on D-Day. This chapter reveals why. From its first conception in 1941, the Atlantic Wall was doomed by the gap between ambition and capacity. Hitler demanded a line no army can break, but Germany no longer had the industrial strength to build such a line. Concrete shortages grew as factories dedicated their production to U-boat pens and Eastern Front fortifications. Steel was diverted to tanks that were being lost faster than they could be built. Even basic materials like rebar and timber ran short. As the Eastern Front devoured resources, the Western Front was left with scraps. Yet, the orders from Berlin grew only more unrealistic. Hitler believed he could shape reality through command alone. His generals knew better, but they lacked the power or the courage to force him to see it. The result was a fortification project held together by patchwork improvisation. For every reinforced bunker with a 155mm gun, there were stretches of beach protected only by sandbags and wooden stakes. Some sectors had state-of-the-art concrete casemates. Others had nothing but trenches dug by exhausted foreign laborers. Hitler envisioned uniform strength along the entire coastline. What he got instead was a mosaic of heavily fortified points separated by wide, undefended gaps. Not a wall. A necklace of isolated strongholds. And any soldier who has studied military history knows the truth. A fortified point becomes a trap when the enemy can simply bypass it. Even in the strong points, quality varied dramatically. Many gun emplacements were designed without considering the actual curvature of the coast. Their fields of fire overlapped poorly, leaving dead zones between them. Some had limited traverse, meaning they could not rotate far enough to track landing craft approaching from unexpected angles. Worse, many of the guns were outdated French, Czech, and Polish artillery seized earlier in the war. They had mismatched calibers, inconsistent ammunition, and spare parts that no German logistics officer could hope to maintain. Several guns were mounted only on wooden platforms, making them nearly useless after the first salvo loosened their fittings. And then there was the labor force. The Atlantic Wall was built not by elite German engineers, but by hundreds of thousands of conscripted workers from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and even the Soviet Union. Many were forced laborers from concentration camps or captured civilians. They were exhausted, underfed, poorly supervised, and often sabotaged the construction whenever they could. Concrete mixtures were intentionally watered down. Steel supports were misaligned. Foundations were laid too shallow. On some occasions, workers smuggled explosives into the concrete pores so the walls would crack under stress. German overseers rarely noticed. They were stretched thin and often uninterested in inspecting details. To Berlin, speed mattered more than integrity. Rommel discovered the truth firsthand when he arrived to inspect the wall in late 1943. He walked among bunkers that smelled of wet concrete and rust. He kicked support beams that shifted under his boot. He saw minefields so sparse that a platoon could walk through them without triggering a single charge. And he immediately understood the danger. This wasn't a finished fortress. It was a theater set. Impressive from a distance. Worthless up close. Rommel pushed for drastic changes. If the wall couldn't stop the Allies with concrete, then it had to stop them with obstacles, thousands upon thousands of obstacles. He ordered beaches to be littered with Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, steel tripods, wooden posts tipped with explosives, mined stakes angled to tear open landing craft, and underwater traps designed to rip apart Higgins boats as they hit the surf. The idea was brutal and elegant. Make the shoreline so deadly that no soldier could land, no vehicle could cross, and no equipment could survive the first moments of the invasion. But even this plan faced impossible constraints. Rommel asked for millions of mines. He received a fraction. He wanted a dense killing zone in the tidal flats. Instead, winter storms washed away many of the obstacles. Worse, German engineers didn't always understand the tide patterns. Many of Rommel's traps ended up sitting too far up the beach, visible, avoidable, and useless. Yet, the greatest failure of the Atlantic Wall wasn't physical. It was philosophical. German high command never agreed on how to defend the coast. Rundstedt, the senior commander in the West, believed deeply in mobile defense. He wanted to hold back armored divisions inland beyond Allied naval guns, then launch a massive counterstrike once the invasion force committed to shore. Rundstedt trusted maneuver warfare. It was how Germany conquered Europe in 1940. To him, the wall was simply a delaying line. Rommel saw things differently. He believed the Allies would achieve total air superiority the moment the invasion began. Once that happened, German armor wouldn't move anywhere without being annihilated by fighter bombers. He had lived through the terror of Desert Air Force attacks in North Africa. He knew the sky was the real battlefield now, not the ground. Therefore, he argued, the only way to win was to destroy the invasion at the waterline before Allied air power could lock down the battlefield. Two brilliant commanders, two incompatible strategies. And Hitler, instead of choosing one, chose both, which meant he chose neither. The compromise ensured disaster. Panzer divisions were split too far inland to counterattack quickly, too far forward to be safe from Allied air power. Rommel's beach defenses were uneven, incomplete, and undermanned. Rundstedt's counterattack plans depended on Hitler's permission, and Hitler refused to delegate authority. When the invasion finally came, armored divisions would wait hours, sometimes days, for orders that never arrived. The Atlantic Wall was built on a foundation of concrete, but its strategy rested on bureaucracy. Even more fatal was Germany's blindness to reconnaissance. The wall may have been fortified, but it had almost no eyes. Allied aircraft photographed the French coast constantly, mapping every bunker, trench, minefield, and artillery position. German anti-air could do nothing to stop them. Meanwhile, German air reconnaissance had essentially died months earlier. Fuel shortages grounded most Luftwaffe fighters. Radar stations were jammed or deceived. And so German commanders were fighting a war they could not see. The Atlantic Wall was not merely undermanned, it was blind. As Allied technology advanced, Germany's illusions deepened. Hitler toured sections of the wall and declared them invincible. Photos were staged to show perfectly aligned obstacles, gleaming artillery, and determined garrisons. Film reels portrayed the wall as impregnable. Soldiers marched proudly through bunkers that had no ammunition. Civilians were told the coast was a fortress. They believed it. Many generals believed it. Even Hitler believed it. And belief is a dangerous thing in war because it makes men ignore reality. The truth was this: the wall was a defense line built by a nation running out of time. Every decision was reactive. Every improvement was rushed. Every inspection revealed new flaws. Rommel wrote to his wife that the wall looked strong only where the Führer happened to visit. And he wasn't exaggerating. As he traveled thousands of miles of coastline, he understood a bitter truth. If the Allies landed in force, the wall would not stop them. It might slow them. It might bloody them. But it would not hold. By early 1944, the Allies had already identified Normandy as the weakest link. The coastline was flatter, the beaches broader, the defenses thinner. The German command, blinded by preconceptions, believed the Allies would never choose such a location. Pas de Calais was the obvious target, the shortest crossing, the direct road to Berlin. But obvious choices are exactly what good strategists avoid. And so the stage was set. A wall built too quickly, defended too thinly, managed too poorly. Rommel raced to reinforce it. Rundstedt argued to maneuver behind it. Hitler boasted about it, and the Allies quietly prepared to break it. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to be Germany's shield. Instead, it became its trap. A static line in a mobile war. A fortress in a conflict already won by movement, deception, and air power. The wall did not fail on June 6, 1944. It failed long before dawn ever broke over Normandy failed in its design, its strategy, its leadership, and the dangerous belief that concrete could substitute for clarity. The Allies hadn't reached the beaches yet, but the wall was already cracked. And in the next chapter, we see how the Allies would exploit every one of those cracks, not with brute force, but with illusions so perfect that Germany would defend the wrong place at the wrong time. They called it the greatest army that never existed, hundreds of tanks that were nothing but rubber, thousands of soldiers who were little more than whispers on a radio, airfields that were flat fields painted with shadows, and entire divisions whose only battlefield was a map table in London. It was the army Hitler feared most, the one he watched for day and night, the army he believed would crash into France and break the Atlantic Wall in one decisive blow. But here is the truth. That army was a ghost, and its purpose was simple: make Germany defend the wrong beach. By late 1943, Allied planners understood one brutal fact: they could not defeat the Atlantic Wall through strength alone. German defenses stretched for nearly 2,000 miles. It was impossible to match that coverage with real soldiers, real ships, and real firepower. The Allies needed surprise, not just on D-Day itself, but in the months leading to it. If the Germans guessed the landing site too soon, they could concentrate every panzer division in one place and crush the invasion before it got off the sand. The Allies did not need to fool Germany once. They needed to fool Germany constantly. And so began Operation Bodyguard, a deception campaign of such scale and audacity that it rewrote the rules of modern warfare. Its motto was simple: in war, what matters is not what is true, but what the enemy believes. The first task was psychological. The Germans believed the shortest route across the Channel de Pas de Calais was the safest, most logical point for an invasion. Geography supported this belief. So did history. For months, Allied planners studied German intelligence patterns, reading decrypted messages from Berlin through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park. And what they found was priceless. The Germans were so convinced the Allies would land at Pas de Calais that they interpreted every small clue as proof. All the Allies needed to do was feed that belief. But deception required layers. The first layer was disinformation small, seemingly random details slipping into German hands, coded messages hinting at supply buildups in Kent, maps accidentally misplaced, double agents delivering subtle shifts of truth wrapped in falsehood. The second layer was physical deception. Inflatable tanks crafted so precisely that aerial photos could not tell rubber from steel. Fake artillery made from plywood. Dummy landing craft stacked along British harbors. Even vehicle tracks were pressed into the dirt at night to mimic armored divisions preparing to move. The third layer was radio traffic. Every army emits a signature through communication patterns, frequencies, rhythms, message formats. Allied signal units studied these signatures and then reproduced them perfectly. German intelligence listening posts recorded Morse signals that matched the first U. S. Army group to the letter. Officers issuing orders. Supply sergeants requesting fuel. Signal posts coordinating maneuvers. Yet the entire force existed only in radio waves. Still, a deception of that scale needed a face, someone the Germans trusted as a genuine threat. There was only one man Hitler feared above all Allied generals: George S. Patton. Brilliant, aggressive, unpredictable, beloved by his troops and respected by German analysts. Patton embodied the offensive spirit the Germans expected in a cross-channel invasion. And so, the Allies placed Patton in command of this phantom army. To German spies, it was confirmation. To Allied planners, it was a masterstroke. Patton toured fake camps, reviewed inflatable tanks, and even delivered speeches to troops who were, in reality, actors or backup regiments masquerading as frontline units. German spies saw only what they were meant to see. Patton, the man who broke Rommel in North Africa, was preparing to break France. Yet the most dangerous part of the deception was not the fake tanks or the radio chatter. It was the double-agent network ordinary men and women who risked execution to feed Berlin exactly what London wanted Berlin to believe. Agents like Garbo, a Spanish double agent who built a network of 27 fictional sub-agents, each with their own biographies, personalities, and reporting schedules. Through him, the Allies transmitted a symphony of lies, troop movements in Kent, fuel dumps along the southeast coast, and fake timetables predicting an invasion at Pas de Calais any day now. Germany swallowed every word. By early 1944, Berlin was convinced the main invasion force would come across the Strait of Dover. Normandy, in their minds, was simply a distraction, a feint designed to draw away German defenders. Rommel suspected otherwise. His frontline experience told him the Allies might choose an unexpected point. But he was overruled. Hitler refused to commit armor near Normandy. Rundstedt could not move panzer reserves without Hitler's approval. And the Luftwaffe lacked the reconnaissance capability to verify anything. The deception was complete. But the illusion went deeper. Deception planners understood that Germany would analyze Allied actions through the lens of its own fears. So the Allies created patterns to match those fears. They launched an air campaign targeting railways in northern France to mimic preparations for a northern assault. They conducted naval exercises in the Channel to simulate pre-invasion drills. They positioned recognizable units one's German intelligence had tracked for years, in locations that made sense only if the real attack was coming at Pas de Calais. Even Allied troop leave schedules were manipulated. Soldiers stationed near Kent were granted fewer leaves. Soldiers stationed near Normandy were granted more. German double agents reported these patterns faithfully. And Berlin drew exactly the conclusion the Allies wanted them to draw. The Pas de Calais buildup was accelerating. Normandy was simply a sideshow. Yet, there remained a final problem. The deception had to survive contact with real German analysts. Germany still had skilled intelligence officers. Even in 1944, they would analyze tide calendars, shipping patterns, weather forecasts, and logistical capacities. So the Allies introduced controlled inconsistencies. A deception too perfect is suspicious. A deception that feels human messy, contradictory, slightly flawed is believable. An Operation Bodyguard was believable because it was messy in all the right ways, training exercises delayed by weather, rumors spreading among troops, contradictory reports from double agents. The Germans interpreted the inconsistencies as honest friction. They trusted the lie because it resembled the truth. As D-Day approached, the deception intensified. German radar installations detected phantom convoys, reflections created by aluminum strips dropped from aircraft. Dummy radio stations transmitted non-stop. Double agents warned Berlin that the Allies were finalizing plans. And Hitler, reading the intelligence summaries, became fixated on Pas de Calais. Even as reconnaissance aircraft reported Allied ships massing near the south coast of England, Hitler dismissed them. He believed, with absolute certainty, that the main attack would be north. The Germans moved their divisions accordingly. Normandy was left thin, vulnerable, and underestimated. Then the weather turned. Storms rolled across the Channel. Waves battered the British coast. German analysts concluded that no invasion could possibly happen in such conditions. They stood down. Patrols relaxed. Key commanders took leave. Rommel went home for his wife's birthday. Hitler slept through the early reports. And in that moment, created not by chance, but by months of psychological manipulation, the greatest amphibious invasion in human history began to move. At 1 a.m., On June 6th, paratroopers drifted through the sky toward their drop zones. Glider troops descended silently toward Pegasus Bridge. Pathfinders marked landing grounds. Minesweepers cleared sea lanes. And the Ghost Army in Kent, the inflatable tanks, the wooden aircraft. The fake radio chatter kept transmitting. Even as Allied ships crossed the channel, German intercept stations heard the radio heartbeat of the first U.S. Army group still humming. To Berlin, the real invasion force was still waiting to launch. The deception had achieved what no fortress, no army, and no fleet ever could. It made Germany defend nothing while the Allies landed everything. The Atlantic Wall, built over years, reinforced with millions of labor hours, supported by thousands of guns, was about to be tested not by brute strength, but by strategic illusion. And because of Operation Bodyguard, many of its strongest defenses would be pointed toward the wrong horizon. The greatest trick of the entire war was not the storming of the beaches. It was the silence before them, silence filled with lies, shadows, and armies that never existed. They would later say the invasion hinged on a single sentence spoken in a quiet room before dawn, 5 words that determined the fate of Europe. I think we can go. But in the hours leading to that moment, nothing felt certain. The channel was boiling. Storms smashed against the British coast. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. And every weather officer in southern England carried the same fear. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history was about to be destroyed, not by the German army, but by the wind. The night before the launch, June 4th, 1944, the Allied fleet had already begun to move. 5,000 ships were at sea when the first violent wave struck. Destroyers pitched dangerously. Landing craft flooded. The armada bucked like a living thing, and by afternoon, the operation had to be postponed. Ships turned around. Troops returned to port. And, in the sudden silence that followed, doubt grew like a shadow. Could they really risk everything on weather that refused to cooperate? But while the Allies hesitated, the Germans relaxed. Their meteorologists, working with limited Atlantic data, believed the storms would last for days. High winds, poor visibility, dangerous tides. They saw no window for an invasion, not even a small one. German commanders released troops for leave. Patrol intensity dropped. Artillery crews grew careless. And the man who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this moment, Erwin Rommel, drove hundreds of miles east to visit his wife for her birthday. The Atlantic Wall, stretched thin by design flaws and internal arguments, was about to face its greatest test with many of its architects absent. Inside Southwick House, Allied headquarters, Eisenhower listened as meteorologist James Stagg delivered the forecast. It was bad, but within the storm, a sliver of hope had opened. A brief break in the weather was coming. A quiet window predicted to last only a few hours. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't safe. But it was enough. And Eisenhower knew the alternative. If he canceled again, the next suitable tide and moon cycle wouldn't come for weeks. By then, German defenses would be stronger. The deception of Pas de Calais might unravel. Troop morale could fracture, and the momentum of the war itself could shift. Eisenhower looked at his commanders. No one spoke. The moment stretched thin. He exhaled, quietly, decisively. Let's go. The invasion was back on launched, not from calm confidence, but from razor-thin conviction. While Allied leaders made the most consequential decision of the war, German commanders misread the skies entirely. Rundstedt believed Normandy was safe. Hitler, consumed by the idea that Pas de Calais was the true objective, refused to release panzer divisions. And at German coastal batteries, soldiers huddled indoors, avoiding rain they thought would last for days. The deception from Operation Bodyguard was still working. Double agents continued feeding German intelligence the same narrative. The first U.S. Army group near Kent was preparing for a massive attack at Pas de Calais. Even as Allied ships set sail toward Normandy, radio traffic from the Ghost Army continued. Germany listened to lies until they became truth. Shortly after midnight on June 6th, while the storm still echoed across the Channel, Allied paratroopers jumped into darkness. Winds scattered them far off target. Many landed in flooded fields. Some drowned before cutting free from their chutes. Others drifted directly into German positions and were killed before firing a shot. But the chaos, strangely, worked in the Allies' favor. German officers could not determine where the main airborne assault had occurred. Scattered drops looked intentional. Confusion looked like strategy. And by the time the Germans realized what was happening, key bridges and causeways had already been seized by small groups of American and British paratroopers fighting in pitch-black fields, holding positions critical for the landings at dawn. At 3 a.m., gliders descended silently toward the Caen Canal and Orne River bridges. Their landings were brutal wooden frames shattering on impact, but effective. The British airborne troops emerged dazed, bruised, but alive. Within minutes, they captured the bridges intact, securing the eastern flank of the invasion. It was the first decisive Allied victory of D-Day, achieved before most German commanders even knew an invasion had begun. Across the Channel, the greatest armada ever assembled pushed through waves that would have broken lesser ships. Minesweepers carved narrow lanes through explosive fields. Destroyers shepherded landing craft. Battleships began to take position, their guns pointed toward the French coastline. A thin fog masked their approach. German radar stations, still fooled by deception measures and atmospheric distortion, believed the main fleet was moving toward Pas de Calais. Normandy was beneath their expectations. Then, at 5:30 a.m., the horizon erupted. Allied naval guns opened fire with a thunder that shook the coastline from Cherbourg to Caen. Shells hit bunkers, radar stations, trenches, machine gun nests, and fortifications carved into cliffs decades earlier. Some German positions were obliterated. Others barely noticed the bombardment. Many bunkers were designed to survive far worse. But the psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers scrambled. Officers shouted orders into radios now jammed by Allied interference. For the first time, the Atlantic Wall faced the storm it was built to repel. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft touched sand. At Utah Beach, the current pushed the initial waves south of their intended zone, an accident that saved hundreds of lives, placing the Americans in a far less fortified sector. The commander on the ground famously announced, "We'll start the war from here," and his troops pressed inland with surprising speed, linking with paratroopers by mid-morning. But 20 miles east, at Omaha Beach, fate had prepared something darker. Rough seas swamped amphibious tanks before they reached shore. Infantry disembarked too far from the beach, forced to wade through deep water under heavy fire. German machine gun nests, protected by concrete and positioned high on cliffs, created killing zones. Soldiers dropped as soon as ramps lowered. Bodies floated in the surf. Engineers tasked with clearing obstacles were killed before reaching their charges. Radios failed. Units became separated, leaderless, pinned down behind shingle banks while German guns tore into them. It was the closest the invasion came to failure. Omaha nearly broke. And had it broken, the entire right flank of the Allied assault would have collapsed. Reinforcements would have nowhere to land. Tanks would remain trapped at sea. The corridor between beaches critical for supply would remain severed. In a matter of hours, D-Day could have turned from a historic victory into a historic disaster. But what saved Omaha was not planning. It was individual decision. Small groups of soldiers' company commanders, engineers, riflemen made choices no plan had predicted. One unit scaled a cliff where the defenders did not expect attack. Others used shell craters as stepping stones, inching forward between bursts of fire. Destroyers risked running aground. moving within 1,000 yards of the beach to fire directly into bunkers. One by one, the German strongpoints fell. And by noon, the Americans had carved a path off the beach, bleeding but unbroken. Omaha was won not by overwhelming force, but by persistence measured in feet. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces fought their own brutal battles. At Gold and Juneau, fortified defenses slowed progress. But Hobart's Funny's engineering tanks designed for mine clearing, bridge laying, and obstacle demolition proved invaluable. Many German positions that would have slaughtered attacking infantry were overrun because strange, ungainly machines soaked up the punishment. At Sword Beach, where resistance was lighter, troops advanced rapidly, linking with airborne units near the Caen Canal. The invasion front 5 beaches wide was finally established. And yet, even as beachheads formed, the true danger was only beginning. The Atlantic Wall was breached, but the German army was not defeated. The real threat lay inland, panzer divisions, mobile units capable of counterattacking with speed and precision. If Germany mounted a coordinated assault on the afternoon of June 6th, they could push the Allies back into the sea. But coordination required authorization. Authorization required Hitler, and Hitler was asleep. His staff refused to wake him. Hours were lost. Rundstedt waited for orders. The 12th SS Panzer Division stalled. The 21st Panzer moved cautiously, unsure whether Normandy was the real target. And even when the first counterattacks occurred near Sword Beach, Allied air superiority crushed them before they could reach full strength. Germany, frozen by its own command structure, moved too slowly. The window for a decisive counterblow closed. By nightfall, over 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. The beaches were connected. Supply lines were flowing. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's grand fortress, had been pierced in a single day. And the truth became undeniable. Fortifications can stop armies, but they cannot stop what armies refuse to fear. June 6th did not end the war, but it ended Germany's ability to win it. By the end of the first week, the beaches of Normandy were no longer beaches. They were arteries, a living body of men, machines, fuel, ammunition, engineers, medics, vehicles, and momentum. The Atlantic Wall, the great stone shield Hitler had promised would turn Europe into a fortress, had been breached. But a breach was not a victory. What came next would decide whether D-Day remained a daring miracle or dissolved into a failed gamble swallowed by the mud of northern France. The battle for Normandy was not the story of one invasion. It was the story of a continent fighting to be reborn and a regime fighting not to die. The first problem was geography. Normandy was not built for war. Every mile inland was broken by hedgerows, ancient earthen walls, 3, sometimes 4 feet high, topped with dense vegetation and roots thick as cables. Each hedgerow formed a compartment, a box in which soldiers could fight but rarely advance. For German defenders, this was paradise. For the Allies, it was a maze. Entire divisions found themselves fighting for days just to take a field barely the size of a football pitch. A tank commander later said, "Normandy wasn't a battlefield. It was 1,000 battlefields stitched together, and inside each one, a handful of German soldiers with a machine gun could stall an entire American company." As the Allies pushed inland, German units tightened their grip. They were not fighting to win the war. Many already knew that was impossible, but they were fighting to define how long Germany could delay its collapse. Every hour mattered. Every field mattered. Every burning tank bought time. And the German army, though battered, still possessed some of the deadliest weapons of the war: the Panzer IV, the Panther, and most terrifying of all, the Tiger. On open ground, these tanks were monsters, armored beasts whose guns could ignite a Sherman at 2,000 meters. But Normandy denied them the open ground they needed. Their engines struggled in the tight lanes. Their turrets had trouble rotating under hedgerow canopies. And Allied aircraft circled constantly, waiting for any tank foolish enough to appear in daylight. The German armor was powerful, but the environment was unforgiving and Allied air supremacy was absolute. Yet the Allies were not immune to their own problems. The Mulberry harbors, those massive artificial ports designed to keep the invasion supplied, were fragile technological miracles. For the first week, they worked flawlessly, funneling thousands of tons of equipment ashore. Then the weather turned. A violent storm hammered the French coast, tearing apart the American Mulberry at Omaha, ripping it into useless steel and concrete. Supplies backed up. Landing craft choked the shoreline. Engineers worked around the clock merely to keep supplies moving. A single logistical failure could have strangled the invasion before it gained real strength. But the British Mulberry, though damaged, survived. And with it, so did the invasion. Meanwhile, to the east, the Canadians pressed toward Caen, a city whose value extended far beyond its map coordinates. Caen was the gateway to the open plains of France. If captured quickly, the Allies could unleash their armored divisions into wide, maneuverable terrain. But the Germans understood this too. They defended Caen with unmatched ferocity. The 12th SS Hitler Youth Division, a fanatical, highly trained, force counterattacked repeatedly. Every village, every bridge, every crossroads became a miniature war. Bombers flattened entire districts. Tanks burned in the streets. By mid-June, the city still held, and the casualties mounted. Some historians would later call the battle for Caen the slow breaking of Europe's knuckles against an iron wall. In the west, the Americans fought toward Cherbourg, the deep-water port they desperately needed to sustain the invasion long-term. The peninsula was a natural choke point, and German defenders used it well. They dug in, sabotaged roads, destroyed bridges, and forced the Americans to fight town by town. When Cherbourg finally fell, after brutal urban combat, it was a shattered skeleton of a city. The docks were blown up, cranes were sunk, warehouses burned. Engineers assessed the damage and declared it the worst port sabotage they had ever seen. It would take weeks to restore even partial functionality. But even a ruined port was better than none. Supplies began to flow. Slowly, unevenly, but enough. Yet during all this, an invisible war raged behind the lines, the French resistance. They were civilians, railroad workers, farmers, teenagers, priests, former soldiers, ordinary people who refused to accept occupation. When D-Day began, they triggered the second phase of their uprising. They blew up rail lines. They ambushed convoys. They sabotaged telephone poles and cut communication cables. Germany's mighty panzer divisions, so often the deciding factor on the Eastern Front, found themselves crawling through a countryside booby-trapped with rebellion. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, which should have reached Normandy in 3 days, took over 2 weeks. Rommel had once remarked, "The French countryside is filled with ghosts. They strike and vanish." He was right, and those ghosts saved thousands of Allied lives. Meanwhile, German high command spiraled into chaos. Rundstedt was dismissed for defeatism. Rommel was severely injured when a British fighter strafed his car. Hitler retreated deeper into delusion, insisting Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion was yet to come. Even as Allied troops fought in the hedgerows, Hitler insisted the Pas de Calais must remain the Schwerpunkt, the focal point. Panzer divisions stayed frozen in reserve, waiting for an attack that would never come. Germany did not lose Normandy only because the Allies were strong. They lost Normandy because their Führer refused to see what was right in front of him. Then came the breakthrough. By late July, the American First Army prepared Operation Cobra, a massive carpet bombing designed to shatter the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô. Over 800 aircraft roared overhead. The sky darkened with the smoke of 1,000 explosions. A corridor of destruction tore open the German front. Some bombs fell short, killing American soldiers, but the damage to German positions was catastrophic. Survivors staggered out of foxholes, numb and shaking. The earth opened, one German soldier wrote, and swallowed whole companies. When the dust settled, the Americans surged forward. The hedgerow prison was cracking. They broke through. And once they did, the battlefield transformed instantly. The confined lanes of Normandy gave way to open fields. For the first time since landing, American armored divisions could maneuver freely. The German army, already bleeding, could not respond quickly enough. Units crumbled. Gaps widened. Towns surrendered. Roads flooded with German soldiers retreating south. Patton arrived like a storm, newly unleashed. His Third Army swept across Brittany with astonishing speed, 50, 70, sometimes over 100 miles in a single advance. German commanders, already overwhelmed, now faced an enemy who moved faster than their maps could track. The Allies were no longer pushing a wall. They were riding its collapse. But perhaps the most decisive moment came at the Falaise pocket, Germany's final chance to escape. Caught between Canadian, British, and American armies, tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in a shrinking corridor. The fighting was savage. Artillery pounded the roads. Aircraft strafed columns of retreating vehicles. Horses died alongside tanks. The air reeked of gasoline and burning rubber. A German officer later described the scene as a valley of death without end. By August 20th, the pocket closed. 50,000 Germans were captured. 10,000 were killed. An entire army group, one of Hitler's last capable forces in the West, was gone. The Atlantic Wall had never truly fallen from the outside. It had fallen from within, from hesitation, miscalculation, deception, fractured leadership, overconfidence, and the slow, grinding truth that no wall can protect a collapsing empire. Normandy was not a storm that hit Germany. Normandy was the moment Germany discovered it could no longer hold back the tide. And as August drew to a close, one final reality became undeniable. The Allies were no longer fighting to secure a beachhead. They were fighting for the road to Paris. And the road was finally open. By late August 1944, the German army in France was no longer an army. It was a shadow. What had begun on June 6th as a desperate gamble across a storm-torn channel had now become something larger, a continental unraveling, a collapse not just of military lines, but of the myth Germany had spent years constructing, the myth of the Atlantic Wall, the myth of invincibility, the myth of a fortress Europe no force could breach. And as Allied troops pushed deeper into the French countryside, the speed of the German retreat said more than their weapons ever had. A regime that once promised a 1,000-year Reich was struggling to survive a single summer. The fall of Normandy had been decisive, but it was what came after. It was the momentum that truly broke Hitler's Western war machine. Once the Falaise pocket slammed shut, eliminating one of the last coherent German formations in the region, the Allies faced something they had not seen in years: open roads, weak resistance, and an enemy more focused on survival than on strategy. For the first time since the invasion began, the fighting no longer moved in agonizing yards, it moved in miles. Every day brought a new town liberated, a new bridge captured, a new German column in disarray. The Allied advance had transformed from a battle into a chase. Patton, unleashed and unstoppable, drove Third Army forward with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. His tanks roared through the French countryside, covering more ground in weeks than entire armies had in months. One officer later said, "We weren't fighting the Germans. We were racing to cut them off before they vanished into the east." German units fell back faster than command could track. Wehrmacht headquarters received reports so outdated they belonged to a different war. Resistance fighters guided the Allies through back roads and forests, sabotaging German movements at every turn. Blowing up bridges minutes before retreating, German trucks reached them. The same countryside that had once slowed Allied progress now betrayed German forces with every mile. And yet, even in collapse, Germany fought with desperation. Isolated pockets of resistance turned villages into battlegrounds. Snipers hid in church towers, firing until ammunition ran dry. Anti-tank guns waited under camouflage nets for columns to pass. There were places where the war still felt as brutal as it had on D-Day: tight corners, sudden ambushes, last stands where German officers shouted orders to men who no longer believed in the orders, the officers, or the war itself. But the collapse was unmistakable. The German army was losing not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked time. And the clock Hitler had wound in 1939 was finally striking midnight. Meanwhile, across France, another storm was rising, this one from inside the cities. The French resistance had grown from small clusters of fighters into a nationwide uprising. Railway strikes, citywide barricades, underground newspapers, sabotage cells, all converging into a roar. By late August, Paris itself was on the edge of revolt. German garrisons received orders to destroy the city rather than surrender it, but many refused. The occupation that had once seemed permanent was dissolving from within. A city that had endured 4 years of oppression was breathing again. When the Allies reached the outskirts of Paris, the fighting inside had already begun. Barricades rose. German forces splintered. Tanks rumbled through boulevards that had been silent for years. And when the French 2nd Armored Division entered the city to the thunder of church bells, the liberation became more than a military victory. It became a symbol, a declaration that the war in the West had shifted irreversibly toward Allied hands. For many civilians, the sight of Allied soldiers rolling past the Arc de Triomphe felt like waking from a nightmare. For many German soldiers, it felt like the final confirmation of a truth they had been trying to deny since June 6th. The Atlantic Wall had not only failed, it had never truly existed. Yet even as celebrations erupted and flags waved from windows, Allied commanders remained painfully aware that the war was not over. The German army was wounded, but it was not dead. The borders of the Reich remained fortified. Hitler, furious and delusional, replaced commanders, issued impossible orders, and demanded counteroffensives from armies that barely existed. Winter loomed. Fuel shortages tightened. The Eastern Front continued to collapse as Soviet forces pushed toward Poland, Prussia, and the Balkans. Germany was surrounded, but like a cornered animal. It became more dangerous as the walls closed in. Still, the strategic truth was undeniable. The Normandy campaign had achieved far more than establishing a beachhead. It had broken the logistical spine of the German Western Army. It had destroyed armor reserves that could never be replaced. It had reclaimed vital territory and opened ports crucial for sustaining the Allied push toward Germany. And perhaps most importantly, it had shattered Hitler's belief that fortifications could substitute for strategy. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and steel, had failed because walls cannot think, cannot adapt, cannot respond to deception, and cannot compensate for commanders trapped in their own illusions. As Allied troops marched east, they carried with them not only the momentum of victory, but the weight of what came next. They knew the war would not end at the Seine or the Marne. They knew the hardest battles were still ahead: Ardennes forests, Siegfried lines, bridges over the Rhine, towns turned to rubble. But they also knew something else, something they had not known since 1940. Germany was fighting backward now, not forward. In headquarters across Europe, American, British, and Canadian commanders studied maps that no longer showed a fortress. They showed a path. And though the path wound through cities, rivers, and defensive belts, it led undeniably toward the heart of Germany. For the Allies, that meant one thing. For the Germans, it meant something darker. The summer of 1944 had not ended the war, but it had ended the myth that Germany could win it. And so, as August faded into September, the truth became clear to every soldier marching east, every civilian waving flags in liberated streets. every commander studying crumpled maps under dim lamps. The Atlantic Wall had fallen not when the first boots touched sand, but when an empire built on fear realized it could no longer scare its enemies. The war would continue, but the momentum belonged wholly to the Allies now. What began with a storm and a whisper, "Let's go," would end only months later with a nation brought to its knees. The Atlantic Wall had promised Germany safety. Instead, it became the boundary where its defeat began, and history would never forget the summer it collapsed. If you've stayed with this story to the end, it means one thing: you refuse to let these moments fade into the shadows of history. So do we. If you want more stories told with accuracy, respect, and the voices of those who lived them, make sure you follow and subscribe. Every click helps keep these memories alive. Thank you for being here and for helping history speak a little louder.